A Chinese citizen does not automatically have the right to live and work in Hong Kong. They need to be able to go through the immigration process, which actually, many times can be very difficult and quite complicated for many of them, especially if they are not from southern China. Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast and from the blog A Bus on a Dusty Road. Today I want to talk a little bit about Hong Kong and China. And I've actually lived in both places, so I feel like this is probably something I'm qualified to talk about. In 1997, when Hong Kong reverted back to China, I had just moved back to Hong Kong. In fact, I moved back to Hong Kong in 1997, about 5 months before the handover ceremonies took place. So I was there actually in Hong Kong during all the handover ceremonies when Hong Kong officially became part of China. So a question that a lot of people sort of ask is, Hong Kong a separate country, or is Hong Kong really a part of China? In order to understand this, we really need to go back to the basic law. And Hong Kong has a law which is kind of a little bit like the Constitution, and it's called the Hong Kong Basic Law. And the Hong Kong Basic Law kind of sets out the rights of individuals and citizens of Hong Kong. And in the Basic Law, in Article 1, it clearly says, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is an inalienable part of the People's Republic of China. So right there, at the very beginning, and the very first article of the Basic Law, it basically says Hong Kong is part of China. And what the Chinese have basically said is that Hong Kong is the Hong Kong and China are one country, but two systems. I remember when the Hong Kong reverted back to China. And I always used to joke with people and say, yeah, the thing that changed the most was that, before you'd go into the government offices, you see a picture of the Queen of England and you see these, red mailboxes, which by the way, I love the British red mailboxes. And suddenly the mailboxes became purple and the Queen of England was no longer in the public offices and you no longer saw her picture anywhere. And suddenly from the British flag flying, there was the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region flag. And so, those were really a lot of the main changes. Like we didn't really see a lot of the soldiers or others there. So without a doubt, Hong Kong is part of China. Or I guess you could look at another one and say China's part of Hong Kong, but really Hong Kong is part of China. But where it starts to get really messy is Article 2 of the Basic Law. And this is where I feel like for myself personally, where I feel like the law gets a little bit messy and where there can be like a lot of confusion. Like you've seen a lot of protests going on in Hong Kong. People have been upset. People have been wondering about it. Again, in Article 2 of the Basic Law, it states, the National People's Congress authorizes the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to exercise a high degree of autonomy and enjoy executive, legislative, and independent judicial powers, including that of final education in accordance with the provisions of this law. So in other words, right there, the Basic Law, 2 says that they have a high degree of autonomy, that they should have a high degree of autonomy. And that's where China's always said, China's always sold it and said, Hong Kong is one country, two systems. We're one country, but two systems. There they talk about that Hong Kong's supposed to have this great degree of autonomy and that they're supposed to have this independent judicial power. What's interesting about this, it doesn't really spell it out in specifics. So it is kind of a little bit vague. What does it really mean with a high degree of autonomy? What does high degree really mean? How much is the autonomy? And that's where I feel like things have gotten really messy because, Hong Kong has felt that they're no longer an independent country with two systems and said that they feel like they're being swallowed up to become part of China. In Article 4 of the Basic Law, it goes on to clarify this and it says, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall safeguard the rights and freedoms of the residents of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and other persons in the region in accordance with law. So the people there are told that they will have their rights and their freedoms will be safeguarded. And they'll have this great degree of autonomy and freedom. And compared to many parts of China, they do, but also now, China, a lot of parts of China now feel a lot like Hong Kong, vice versa. Shanghai, Guangzhou, there's, except for the fact that in China, you still can't really get on YouTube. You can't get on Facebook. The Chinese really are not engaged with the world as far as it goes with social media and other things. Hong Kong, you can get on YouTube, you can get on Facebook. They have Western news. All of those things you will find in Hong Kong, which the Chinese look upon as a high degree of autonomy that they have. Then in Article 5, it says the socialist systems and policies shall not be practiced in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and the previous capitalist system, the way of life, shall remain unchanged for 50 years. So the Chinese have almost only promised that Hong Kong's way of life will remain unchanged for 50 years. After 50 years, we really don't know. Is it going to revert back to China? What are the changes going to be? Nobody really quite knows what the changes will be after these 50 years. And so that really is the interesting part of this. Will China become... will Hong Kong then become a socialist country then? Will they be swallowed up and become, completely part of China? Or will they still remain one country, two systems? The interesting part of this, and having lived in Hong Kong and having worked in Hong Kong and having lived and worked in China, is the Hong Kong people feel very much like they are Hong Kong. They do not feel like they're necessarily mainland Chinese. That becomes a little bit of the difference, some of the differences here. In Article 8 of the Basic Law, it states that the laws previously enforced in Hong Kong, that is the common law, rule of equity, ordinances, subordinate legislation, and customary law shall be maintained, except for any that contravene this law and subject to any amendments by the legislature of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. I have studied Chinese law. In fact, I have what's called, this can be a lot of alphabet soup behind it, but MMLCBLA, which basically stands for Masters of Law, Chinese Business Law. I took a course in Hong Kong on Chinese business law. And I took the course because I was quite curious about Chinese business law. I wanted to understand more about Chinese business law. And I wanted to sort of, just have this sort of like this knowledge and understanding. I am myself, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I figured having, living and working in China and in these countries, it was important for me to be able to understand a lot about the laws. And one thing that really stuck out for me in the study of the Chinese law was that throughout the Chinese law and throughout the legal system in China, if you read the Chinese Constitution, it almost reads and sounds like the U.S. Constitution. And when I read it, I'm like, oh my goodness, like this could have been written by the American forefathers. I mean, the way the Constitution reads, you would think there was total freedom in China, that there was, that they had the freedom to vote, the freedom for everything. Except the Chinese always have one word in there, except it goes against the state. In China, you have complete freedom, except it goes against the state. And that's what I kind of read in this when I look at this, where it says, except for any that contravene this law. That basically, there's the Chinese sort of love, I've decided, having read the Chinese laws and studied the Chinese laws, that they sort of love this sort of vagueness of the laws. The lawyers and people that are in law, we want the law to be precise. We want the law to be exact. You want to be able to read the law, understand the law, and know exactly what the law is about. But especially if you're in business, you want to be able to read the law, know the law. I can do this, I can't do this. And then you want to know exactly what that law is about. But in the Chinese law, and also in this basic law, there's a lot of fuzziness going on that I see personally. This is my own personal opinion. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but this is from me having studied Chinese law. And that was my feeling under Chinese law. Because if you read the Chinese laws and you study the Chinese laws, it talks about due process. It talks about the right to vote. It talks about the rights of freedoms. It talks about all of these things. But then in every single law is except it goes against the state. And what does that mean? What exactly does it mean? like you have the right to vote, except it goes against the state. You have the right for freedom, except it goes against the state. So that's where I think that, for a lot of these laws that it's where some of the problems is, as I personally see it myself, is that it's one country, two systems. But in Hong Kong, you have people who are used to the Western way of the system. They're used to the law being precise, the law being exact. They're used to understanding the law. Whereas in China, the law is very much it's except it goes against the state. So basically saying that you can do anything you want to do, except if the state doesn't like it, you can't do it. So you need to really understand what is it the state likes or the state doesn't like. And that's why in China, you'll see things like I had one of my former managers, her mother-in-law was a Falun Gong, which the Chinese do not like the Falun Gong, which is a religious organization. And she, got arrested. And for like 3 months, they didn't even know she was arrested because they considered the Falun Gong, of course, unless they went against the state. And then, so she didn't really have the right for due process to get a lawyer immediately for her family to know where she was, et cetera, because she went against the state. So, that's why this kind of like this way of thinking is sort of important. I want to talk a little bit about why China and Hong Kong are one country and two systems. And if you haven't been to this parts of the world, this is kind of an interesting thing for you to understand a little bit of what's going on there. First of all is the border control. You cannot just go freely from China to Hong Kong. There is a border control. There are two separate immigrations. There are two separate border controls. A Chinese person must have the right to go to Hong Kong. They must have a visa. And a Hong Kong person must have the right to go to China. So, all of that hasn't really changed. You must still have the right between both of them. You must go through the border control when you go in. Also, the right of abode. There's a huge thing here about what's called the right of abode. And the right of abode in Hong Kong is basically like, do you have the right to live and work in Hong Kong? A Chinese citizen does not automatically have the right to live and work in Hong Kong. They need to be able to go through the immigration process, which actually, many times can be very difficult and quite complicated for many of them, especially if they are not from southern China. I have found that those that are from southern China, maybe, going up visiting Hong Kong may be easier, maybe for some of the major cities, but somebody that might be out in the middle of nowhere, it may be more difficult for them to get to Hong Kong. So it's just not like every Chinese citizen can suddenly go to Hong Kong because they want to go there. They still have to go through the immigration process, and they don't have the right to live there just because they're Chinese citizens. They have to have the right. And, that goes back to my third point, is that Chinese must get visas to Hong Kong, and a Hong Kong person must get visas or must have the right to go into China. The legal system, they both have very different legal systems. In Hong Kong, the official language in Hong Kong is still English and Chinese. This means that as a foreigner, if you have to go to court in Hong Kong or you need to do government things, you can do so in English. The paperwork, the documents will all be in English. You can do your taxes in English. You can do everything in English. That English is one of the official languages of Hong Kong. Not so true with China. China, it is Putonghua or Mandarin Chinese. So you have to really be able to speak, read, and write Chinese. The financial systems are both very different. In Hong Kong has been considered a financial or a banking capital of the world. The transactions, the way money flow in and out is very different. Whereas, Hong Kong, you can have a US dollar bank account. You can have you can keep foreign currency. You can, easily get foreign currency out of the country. Foreign currency is very much a part of Hong Kong's banking system. In China, that is not true. It's a lot more difficult. There's a lot more foreign currency and currency controls within China. The social media and other freedoms. In China, it's very difficult to get on many types of social media, including Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, YouTube. Instagram. Those are all very difficult. In fact, to get on them, you really need to have a VPN, but a VPN is not quite legal in China. If you want to be able to watch like Prime Video, you want to, get onto YouTube to see the news, you really need to be able to have a VPN to get around the Great Firewall of China. And to be honest with you, the average Chinese just doesn't have that. It's very difficult for them to get. It's a very hard thing for them to get. And so, most Chinese do not bother with, getting on things like Facebook, WhatsApp, and other things. And I personally myself have felt like this is a way of competition. It sort of works on both sides, and that the factories that want to export to the rest of the world, they don't really have the ability to gauge in the world where the world's engaging because they can't be on these platforms. It's difficult for them to be on the platforms. And then factories that want to sell in, people that want to sell into China, it's also difficult because it's a whole new social media system. It's a whole new way of working because China really has their own social media platforms, which are very much for China and Chinese. Elections and democracy is very different. In Hong Kong, the Hong Kong citizens have the right to run for an office and be elected into an office. And this is where in the past there's been a lot of issues for that. In China, that's not true. You don't. China does have some elections at the village level and things, but it's really like, again, it's that unless it goes against the state. You can be elected, but you can't go against the state. So in other words, as long as you're, pro-China, pro-communism, pro-socialism, the People's, Republic of China, you can be elected. You can be, in this election. But if it goes against the state, you have a problem. So that's why you can see, there's a difference between Hong Kong and China, that, it is one country and two systems, but in the same way, it's one country. So it's kind of like this really sort of like fuzzy area, which for me personally, I think it'll be very interesting to see what does happen 50 years from now. I'm not sure if I'll be alive then, but it won't be quite 50 years because it was in 1997. So it's actually coming up to be, it's coming up actually relatively soon here. It'll be interesting to see what are the changes that take place. And I think a lot of that will be like, does China open its door more? Does China become more, a free democratic society? Or does China go back more to socialism? Or do they crack down harder? I think that will make a real difference between this and exactly what happens in the world order between now and then.